There was a name I didn't recognize, Michael. The letter was old, ink faded brown at the edges, folded so many times the creases had turned soft. It slipped out of a book she'd owned since before we met, while I was packing boxes for the renovation, and I read it. Maybe I shouldn't have, but I did. She wrote to him like he was the only person who understood her, like she'd been carrying something enormous, and he was the only one she could set it down with. I need you to know I'm sorry for all of it, for not being there, for what happened that night and everything that came after. I've never stopped thinking about it. I sat on the floor of our study for 3 hours. 16 years of marriage, a house we renovated twice, kids' birthdays and anniversaries, and the year we nearly lost everything and held each other up anyway. 16 years believing I knew this woman, and I had never once heard the name Michael. By the time she got home, the letter was on the kitchen table like evidence. I didn't yell. I didn't have to. She walked in, saw what was sitting there, and went completely still. Not guilty still, grief still. That was the first thing I got wrong. "Sit down," she said, and something in her voice, something exhausted and old, made me do it. She told me Michael was her father's name. He had died 11 years before we met. She was 22. She had been driving. The accident alone had been devastating enough, but the aftermath was worse. Her father, in his final months, had told her something about their family she had never repeated to anyone, a history she'd spent decades quietly carrying so it couldn't reach the people she loved. "Don't bring this into your new life," he had written to her, months before he died, his handwriting already unsteady by then. "What happened was not your fault, but the rest of it, what we did, what we were, that stays with us. Protect what you're building." She had. For 20 years she had protected me from it, not because she was ashamed of who she was, but because her father had begged her to let it end with him, and she had honored that. The toxic ex I had spent 3 hours convinced she was mourning was her brother. He had been in the car that night. He hadn't survived. The guilt in that letter, the grief I had read as longing, was a 22-year-old girl writing to her dying father, apologizing for surviving something she hadn't caused. I had been ready to end our marriage over a woman's private grief. I sat with that for a long time, too. She didn't ask me to apologize. She didn't make it about what I'd assumed. She just sat across the table, hands around her mug, and waited to see who I'd be when the dust settled. 16 years in, and somehow I had missed this about her. She never made the people she loved prove themselves in advance. She just waited. The letter hadn't destroyed our marriage. The version I'd invented in those 3 hours, the one where she was hiding something, where I was the fool, where Michael was the ghost of someone she'd chosen instead, that version was gone. What replaced it was something heavier and truer. She had carried her whole family's wreckage alone, quietly, for 2 decades, so that none of it would ever touch me. I called that a secret. She called it love. She wasn't wrong.